Namaste and good evening, everyone. We welcome you all to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste.
And we are very happy to have Narad, who started the series with us. Namaste, Narad.
Namaste, Alina.
Today we have a special series on sacred objects, and we will take a question from our viewer. It's a very topical and relevant question, so we are listening to the question read by Narad.
Yes, it is a very interesting question, and I may have some things to add as well. Here is the question. Had Mother given any guidelines for preserving a sadhak's belongings? Should a sadhak's things be preserved? How and who should preserve? Where and when? Under what circumstances should it be preserved? If the energetic vibrations of the person reverberate in these objects, are items used near the body, like clothes, comb, and furniture, more vibrant than things used occasionally? Please share your insights.
Yes.
This is a wide-ranging question.
It is. And we'll broaden the scope even more.
We invite all our viewers to add more questions in the chat box or send your question at our email ID, integralstudies.in@gmail.com. Perhaps this topic will open other sessions also to follow.
I want to use this question as a starting point and widen it as much as possible to what is it that first is preserved and why would you find it important? There could be things which an object carries which have a purely physical value. There could be a content which is subtle physical, a content which is vital or energetic, emotional content, a mental content, a spiritual content, or a complex mix of all these. So really the value of it is in terms of what it is that you're carrying. In many cases, if the content is purely of a vital, emotional, or mental kind, a few centuries down, where that quality of consciousness is irrelevant for evolution, you would probably look at that and say, this belongs to the past, it has no relevance for the future. And the universe itself, as it moves forward, will as if swallow up, the things would break down in some way or other or become not relevant. Take as an example even your own consciousness, let's say 10,000 years ago or many lives ago, and if you looked at that consciousness in relation to today's consciousness, assuming we have made a spiritual progress and not regressed, then you'd look back and say, yes, that was good, but it was a stage, I am well beyond that. And it's something in that direction with what an object contains also. But think about it in this way. All these gradations have value. But the lower the gradation, the shorter duration of value. Even a physical object might have financial value. There are people who actually sell papers signed by the mother or books signed by the mother, and for them it's the financial value which is important rather than the consciousness content, and each would align to what is relevant to them. And I'm making this distinction because it's very important that we distinguish between vibrations that an object carries, which is subtle, physical, vital, energetic, emotional, mental, and spiritual. You can even go to many famous places which have some kind of a, let's say, spiritual association, even sometimes relics of saints. And the actual content might have a strong vital content or vital emotional content and perhaps very little of spiritual. But the person has been made a saint because there's a machinery. For example, in the Catholic Church, it's a machinery of how a saint is selected based on miracles and various other things. It has nothing to do with the spiritual content. The person need not be spiritual at all, but if it was a charismatic person, which means a strong vital, that alone is enough to get you to a position of sainthood. So you may look at relics or objects used by that person or even try to connect to those and have zero spiritual value. In time, what remains is only an idea. So the church will say so and so is patron saint of whatever activity that they have officially designated. And it has zero implicit truth, zero implicit value. But a formation could be built up. And so it's a formation of people's vital energies or associations or emotions which has been associated with that, which is what you're connecting to, again with zero spiritual value. So first I'm pointing to this, that there are gradations of content that an object or even a person could have. The second thing I want to highlight is the source of that vibrational content. I'm using vibration now in a general way. It could be emotional, subtle, physical, or spiritual, or anything in between. The vibration is sourced from where? Very often it happens that we have a familiar association. For example, if I look at an object used by my great-grandmother or somebody that in my childhood I had a strong affinity with, I look at the object or even a photograph and I feel a welling up of affection or emotion associated with my childhood memories that I have with that person or those situations. The person has already reincarnated perhaps, and the object itself might carry no significant vibration, but just looking at it triggers in me a certain welling of emotions for which to me it would be valuable. To somebody else looking at the same object, or if they hold it, they may have nothing. It may be hollow, it may have lost whatever content it had, if at all it had any. So first of all, we recognize the source of the vibe might be within us, triggered now by familiar association, a name, idea, and just an image sometimes. Oh, here is a picture of such and such a deity. I remember once there was a lady who had somehow got involved with, let's say, some spiritual lineage or teacher in Rishikesh, and she said to me, oh, he has given me a blessed necklace. So she showed that, and it was some imprinted in metal image of some deity, perhaps it was Krishna, I don't remember now. But when she held it up, it was completely empty, it had nothing. So it was a trinket basically given by the person, but the value that she had, it is given by X. That was important. But if you held the object, it had zero spiritual or even emotional content. She had an association. So our familiar association is the first common source. The second is actually the original person's vibes. So if somebody has used an object and the object is infused with the vibe, and we'll talk about how that happens also, then that object may continue to sustain that vibration for a while. Now here's the catch. If you did nothing, it may in time fade out, again depending on the gradation of what was infused and also the way it was infused, which we will look at. Typically in time things tend to fade out. Even if it has been intentionally infused, it tends to fade out. But if it has been then used by many, oh, this is so precious, let me touch, and let's say 1,000 people have touched it, then the infusion of the 1,000 people often would be stronger than the original person's infusion and would overwhelm and even erase that. You could still draw back from the original if you had the means. We'll talk about that shortly. But recognize that the actual handling has an infusion, but if 1,000 people handle, you will very likely override that. Then there is infusion that happens from a person's invocation during use. So there are saints who prayed to a certain deity. That deity, because they concentrated upon or invoked a certain presence when they prayed, would have an infusion, the person may have never touched it. So I remember once I had gone to some place in Rajasthan, and they claimed, I don't know if it's true, they claimed that the deity of Krishna that they had in their fortress temple was actually the one which Mirabai had worshipped. I don't know if it's true or it was just for them a way of getting tourism, but the question would be, if she had worshipped and dwelt upon Sri Krishna, Mirabai is a very famous saint, and she used to enter states of complete identification with Krishna, forgetting herself totally, and in that state of complete identification, even her body was impervious to poison when they tried to poison her. So, an object so worshipped might perhaps hold an invocation if it survived very long, but at least at that moment it would hold. So it's not even used by the person directly, it's in the relationship built. Then I said the infusion that comes from people who have touched it. And if the number of people is large enough and the presence within not strong enough, you will get the overriding. So what you may end up with is the presence of the people who touched rather than the people, the original source that you are expecting. Then comes something more complex. Your expectation can project onto an object a certain presence or a feeling just because you come with that expectation. And because many people come again and again with that expectation, you may actually project something on it which is yours or which a large number of people have projected. For example, there are many sacred places which are associated with miracles. And more likely than not, there is a formation built up by people. So often a town, in Europe this is quite common, will make up a story about some sacred object. They'll say, oh, here's a stream, this is a sacred stream, and there's a special presence there for healing. When people start coming with the expectation of healing and wanting to be healed, that itself projects a certain energy, and a variation of that is their aspiration, devotion or expectation can invoke a certain presence. Because there's a certain receptivity people have in relation to this object, let's say a sacred stream or sacred lake, the fact that so many go there, it gives a chance for a higher consciousness to say, yes, here's a chance to help or influence, or even a lower consciousness which could come in. And so I'm showing you a list of various sources of the vibe. Which of these is it? And very often for an object that has been around for a long time, it's a blend of many of these. I would give an unusual example. There was a tooth of the mother which I believe was preserved by Champak Lalji, and it came down through two people to the person who currently has it in Pondicherry. I'd heard about it many times and people had told me, we went and we saw the tooth of the mother. And I said, wow, that's interesting. What did it feel like? But at some point I happened to be with the person in his house and he showed me the tooth. But what I realized at that point was, normally you would have kept it in a box and kept it so people to view. He was taking it out, himself handling and giving it to people. So people would touch it, it's mother's tooth, and then give it back. So when he did that and I held it, the overwhelming impression was of the thousands of people who have put their energy into it in handling. And it was, at least I could not get through to the part which was actually the mother's consciousness. Had the thing been kept carefully, had it been protected, had the handling, physical touch been avoided, people might still have held, or the object might still have held a certain presence and might have been amplified because people come with devotion. But the touching, because remember, how does an object hold or carry consciousness? Because our consciousness is not an abstraction, it is substance. Our physical consciousness has a subtle physical substance which flows of various gradations of density. There's the most dense, which is what they call ectoplasm in occult science, but there are various finer gradations. And similarly, your vital consciousness is substance, mind is substance, spiritual consciousness is substance of gradations. the fact that you handle, the fact that you infuse consciously or unconsciously, it's the substance attached to the object which is the primary carrier. Now, if you allow substance of others now to overwhelm this, it will likely erase or dissolve or simply eject what was originally there, and your new substance now takes over. Which, in this case at least, that was my first impression. Perhaps, I'll speak about this, you can draw out, you can draw back what was original. So, I'll just come to this point shortly. So, there can be many sources of the actual substance held or the consciousness held. So, the next question from this would be, how long does it last? Because if it doesn't last long, then it has very little value. The mother generally gave as a guideline, because the mother was giving blessing packets. These were made of paper wrapped. Inside would be rose petals that she had blessed. The petals would be dried, put in a semi-transparent paper, and which would then be put in some special paper. And those were kept next to the mother when she gave somebody a blessing in a physical way for a physical transmission of spiritual force. She would take that, infuse a certain intention or force, and give what was then called the blessing packet. Now that tradition has continued. The packets are now kept in the mother's room to be infused with her force and then distributed. So in time, the value of it has become more and more casual. Where earlier the mother gave it with a certain force, now it is even given mechanically. People don't even know what it is. So they receive it, they look at it, what is this? They open it thinking there's an object inside. They see, oh, what's that? That looks like a flower petal. They take it out. Oh, what's this flower? A dried petal. I don't know what it is. They put it away or throw it. Many have done that. And when you give it casually in this way, you take 1, 2, 3, and I've seen this sometimes. People say, I'll get more blessings if I take 3 of them or 10 of them. I have a greater quantum of blessings. It depends. Variations to this, people actually go with something, place it on the samadhi with the intention to infuse or invoke. And again, the principle is the same. There is an infusion of substance always. And then you have to protect the substance. It's not the object anymore, it is the substance that you have to protect. So, how long does it last? Well, depends on how long or in what way you're able to protect that substance. So, with the blessing packets, the general guideline that the mother gave was to keep it for 1 year. And after 1 year, generally she said the force dissipates and either it has to be renewed, or she said it can be disposed of. And again, what is the method to dispose in such a case? Generally we were told that to either burn or to put in the ocean or some flowing water. Burning would be naturally more aligned to our need, where it dissipates as if into the cosmos, and whatever force might be in it also dissipates. There are people who actually keep it, and especially things which have been blessed by the mother, they would keep it for a long time. And again, my point would be, if you held with the reverence, if you held with the purity, perhaps the force can be kept long enough. Again, what grade of force would still be important? In this case, it would be a force which is purely spiritual. Now again, I give an example here because I had with me certain blessing packets which the mother had blessed, which someone had given me. And I had gone to meet somebody who had certain very high, let's say, spiritual sensitivity, power, or even healing power. And I was curious to see, my goal was actually for him to feel the touch of the mother's consciousness. So 2 things happened. I'm sharing a few personal things here. I sent him a photograph where I was standing, and in the background you could see the mother's balcony. So when I sent him the photo, he held the photo and immediately he said, "Where is this?" And he could feel something very special. But it was not from me, it was coming from that. So once I pointed it out, he laughed. But when I gave him the blessing packet, and my intention was to connect to that, to the presence, he held it and said, "Oh, it's empty, there's nothing in it." And then before I could say anything, he said, "Don't worry, I will infuse spiritual force in it." And he held it and did a movement of as if blowing. infusing force and gave it back to me. And I said, oops. But just to say that it can be re-infused either by the same person or by somebody else, or by your own aspiration, by actual invocation. So you could take the same blessing packets and consciously invoke the mother's presence, and you will find it renewed. If you treat it with respect, hold it with the necessary purity, that you don't have other junk substance coming in, invading, you can even as if renew, reactivate from your attention, love, respect, aspiration with which you relate to it. So this is very important. When you trivialize, when you neglect the presence itself, it doesn't need to. It tends to withdraw, especially when it is surrounded by the very contrary vibes. The spiritual presence will never insist and push its way. It will simply gradually withdraw. And if at any point you change the circumstances and again bring back the love, respect, and protect the purity of the presence, it can again reinfuse, or you can invoke it, and again it can begin to grow. And I have shared before an experience I had. It was in one of the centers in the United States where I had gone. I was there for 2 or 3 days, and I didn't know it had Sri Aurobindo's relics. So I was staying with the people who were looking after it, and I came. Nothing happened. One full day we were waiting to meet somebody else who was in the center, and at some point they said, okay, now we have appointment, we go and meet. So we went, met that person. He narrated how he had met the mother. It was a nice experience. And as we came out, I kept persistently, I felt a pull in a certain direction, and there was a wooden shack. And I said to my host, what's there? They'd never taken me there. Oh, there we have Sri Aurobindo's relics, he said. It was such a shock. I said, but then I want to go there. And they were surprised. They said, oh, okay, you can go, it's open. That level of trivialization of Sri Aurobindo's relics was almost hurtful. I entered, it was full of dust. There were leaves, dried leaves, which had somehow got in through the window perhaps, scattered all over, dust everywhere. And it was so painful to see. But what I felt also was a very deep, it was not active with force. It was not a presence which was thriving as you would normally expect. It was a calm, partial withdrawal of Sri Aurobindo's presence, held with deep, I will use the word, compassionate patience, as if he is waiting. But it was half withdrawn. So I went there, I apologized to the presence with my hand, I wiped whatever dust was there, I did my pranam. I could feel the presence, for sure, it was strong. But it was in that poise, not thriving, not active, not dynamic, half withdrawn, held. And so when I went back and I told them, well, how often do you go there? And they said, oh, we go 4 times a year. When we have the darshan, people come and we have a meditation there. And again, that was a bit of a shock. The people had absolutely no sensitivity to what it meant to have Sri Aurobindo's relics. And then I said to them, it was full of dust. It is held in this state which is almost like a disrespect to Sri Aurobindo's presence. At least can you sweep it, wipe it, and put flowers, maybe daily, if once a week, I don't know. So yeah, maybe we could do that. That was it. I don't know what happened subsequently. But I give this as an example of the neglect and the way the presence would respond to a neglect. In this case, it was merely neglect. If there was an assault of the negative vibrations, contrary vibrations, it would have withdrawn completely. But the fact that it was neglected, well, something stayed, but in a partially withdrawn state. And I'm sure when people came with devotion on the darshan days, because it's a center, it would again activate perhaps, and then perhaps withdraw. So the point though is, you have to maintain, you have to protect, and it can be renewed if you take the trouble. Now, all this which I have described till now is relevant for everything, any presence of anybody obviously we have a greater value for a spiritual presence, but it would be true equally for a strong emotional contact you had with one of your grandparents. It could be true of a tenant living in a house who moves out and then you come in, or from the former owner and you come in, and there would be the same imprint. Again, what grade, what kind, and how it's held. The principle is the same. A hotel room, again, this principle would be same for spiritual spaces, including formal spaces such as temples, where there's an active technical process of invoking the presence. Now, you don't see this everywhere. As far as I know, you do not have that in a mosque. There is no formal process of invocation. It's just a spot. Any spot can be turned into a prayer space as long as you turn and face Mecca within the Islamic tradition, as far as I know. But in the Catholic tradition, there are rituals for invocation, for sanctifying. That, I believe, is lost in the Protestant tradition. But in India, the whole temple invocation is a very highly refined, complex science, which closely aligns to the same technologies used in occult practices to invoke specific presences. Again, they may not be spiritual necessarily. Typically, they are something of the vital grade of a spiritual source. So often they will speak of 5 elements or the planetary gradations of consciousness. Behind it might be a spiritual deity, but what you tap into is its vital representation. Just as in India, very often, when you go to a Kali temple, it's not Mahakali. It's not the poise which would be in the, let's say, overmental zones. It would be a projection or a reflection of that in the vital domain. And it could be of a higher vital or lower vital. Accordingly, the color, form, gradation of substance, consciousness would be very different. Spiritually relevant or not entirely, and can be very different. Just because you call it by that name does not mean it is that. The mother even spoke of how in many temples a lower consciousness invades and takes over if the purity has not been maintained. She spoke of how in one of the churches in France, I believe it was, that she saw this gigantic spider form behind the church altar, which was sucking energy of all those who came to pray. And this is something most people do not realize. These beings, entities, in your consciousness, and including your devotion and your love and affection, which you pour out to that deity there. And for them, that's a certain grade of nutrition and nourishment. It does not have a spiritual value. And they feed back to you to trigger more of that sentiment. And so it can be a very complex relationship, not always spiritual, even though the name associated is of a particular religion or a deity or even a spiritual identity. So I'm saying all that we discussed is actually relevant for all these different gradations of locations, spaces, even people, and relics used by people or even put in a part of their nails or hair. So this is a general background I've placed. And now let's go to specifically relics of spiritual people, and then we will come to relics of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. So Narad, would you like to add something, or shall we wait for the relics of Sri Aurobindo and Mother? How would you like to do?
Wait.
Yes. Yeah, okay, you'll wait for that. Okay. So I'm just giving a broad background so that we have a really deep understanding of this. So relics of spiritual people generally, across traditions, you'll find there is a certain respect people have because they respect the person or they respect the spiritual power they embodied, etc. But the experience, if you have to always go by the experience. What I found is not all spiritual teachers embody a spiritual presence. So in a lineage typically, and a lineage could go back even many hundreds or thousands of years, in a lineage typically, there is a transmission of some kind, of a power held. The power often has a strong vital content, which is how it builds popularity. Popularity, charisma always shows strong vitality. It is never a sign of spirituality. There could be a spiritual content also, but the spiritual content without the vital content would not be massive in numbers. It would not draw masses. If it draws masses, there is a strong vital content into which there may be or may not be a spiritual content. Depends. So just because somebody preaches from a spiritual text, or tells you stories from a spiritual tradition, or teaches you the philosophy or practice of a spiritual teacher, does not mean that the consciousness the person lives or transmits, or even the lineage transmits, is spiritual. It could be intellectual, with a touch of spiritual light somewhere. It could be strongly vital, especially when you have a large mass movement, again with a touch of spiritual light somewhere, which again could be simply by the fact that the person who's teaching or the people who come to receive have a certain aspiration. Just that much. So, key point, not all spiritual teachers embody a spiritual presence. So if you took their relics or even their blessing, it may or may not have a spiritual value, but it may have a vital, sentimental, emotional, or other value, certainly. Second point, even if a person has a spiritual presence that they live in occasionally, let's say this person goes into deep trance, comes back with a strong spiritual afflatus, but then he does not infuse it into his physical body. Let's say he's in an ascetic tradition where the physical body is something looked down upon. Even he will abuse and criticize it. Then the afflatus which has been brought will be held for a while in the body, but may not be entrenched fully in the body. What happens normally in such cases? You have a deep afflatus as you come back. As you remain, the afflatus itself begins to fade because you are coming back into the dullness of your corporeal consciousness, in which you have not taken the trouble to connect the experience. Typically, and that's the common experience, the thing fades out in about 3 days. Now what you have is an ordinary body and an ordinary consciousness of a person who had an extraordinary experience or access. Will they still hold that? To the disciples, as I said, often there's a strong memory. Often there is a strong association of what the teacher held or meant. If the person has taken trouble to infuse into that space, consciously or unconsciously, the fact that he meditates there, the fact that he sees disciples in a certain space, there is an imprint infused there. That may stay, but the person's body may or may not carry. This is the interesting thing. I don't want to take names in this case but there are good examples you may all perhaps recognize, where even people who held an experience of the self did not give value to their body, but the space in which they invoked or held their meditation or transmitted the presence of the self holds that still. The body itself may or may not, because to them the body was trivial. So this is another point you have to take. Not all embody, and those who do embody may infuse into the physical or subtle physical in different degrees. And depending on that, again, there will be variations. So an object they have used, let's say they've just come out of an intense afflatus, still carrying it in the body. They lift an object, use it during that time. A pen used to write, for example. It may still be infused with something. In time it may thin, it may fade because there has not been a renewal. But what is the grade of substance that was infused? And I'll contrast this with somebody who actually takes trouble to embody, to infuse for purpose of awakening the body consciousness and divinizing it. There is an embedding which is really, really deep, to a point where the body itself, depending on the degree of embedding, will hold that highest consciousness even after the person leaves the body. Such is the case, obviously, with Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Such is not the case with all their disciples, at least not equally. But with them, this is certainly the case. And therefore, even after they have left the body, or if they have used an object with an intention, the content of it is far more materially tangible and transmissible. There is even a particular experience, and I will draw on my personal experience here. There's a particular grade of substance which you will find in the samadhi of Sri Aurobindo and the mother which I have not been able to feel anywhere else. A certain presence of the samadhi you can feel in many places, even where Sri Aurobindo's relics have been installed, and or even otherwise where there is a meditation room, people have built a presence, you can feel that. But there's a particular grade which is almost material. That is, I have not felt anywhere except in the physical contact of the samadhi and in certain centers where Sri Aurobindo's relics have been installed, but not in all. And there, when you touch that space, you feel it. And I'm saying this, it is quite objective in my experience, because I'd been to someone's house, they had a meditation room, we walked in, there were photographs, there was no obvious physical object anywhere other than photographs. But I felt that grade, dimly, but it was there distinctly. I came out and I said to them, "Do you have Sri Aurobindo's relics here?" And he smiled and said, "Yes, it's hidden, but it's kept there." It is as objective as that. So there's a particular gradation which they have worked to infuse into the body. And so that consciousness has gone all the way down to almost a material grade. This you can feel. But because for them the goal was a physical transformation, which is not the case for the overwhelming majority of saints or spiritual teachers. So the degree of infusion is a critical element. The gradation of substance infused into the physical is another element. The receptivity of the substance into which it is infused. Now again, this is important. Your physical body is one of the most interesting vehicles. It can hold, of course, physical consciousness, vital, emotional, mental, and spiritual of various gradations. Not all. Some bodies are very dull, they cannot hold things of a certain refinement. But still, metals, plastic, stone, glass can hold to different degrees. So in the temple science in India, they created a particular blend of metals. I think it's a mix of 5 metals, if I remember right. And this was used to make certain kind of temple idols, because it made it particularly receptive to a high gradation of spiritual consciousness. And it had a special name given to it. I think it's called Panchaloha, I think it's called, five metals mixed. So plastic and certain types of plastic are very poor in receptivity. Stone is relatively better. Crystals particularly are very strong for certain gradations of vibes, but if they can hold certain gradations, particularly vital, mental, then you can easily infuse spiritual also. So, but they tend to be more naturally aligned to vital and mental. And it can be very powerful, it can be very intense, to a point where you could actually infuse a certain quality of force in a crystal, which could include even an entire spiritual knowledge experience content. I'm using this phrase, knowledge experience. It's almost like a bundle of your full experience, and the knowledge of that experience is held almost intuitively, infused into this crystalline thing, and then given to somebody. And if that person receives with the right state of openness, it can be transmitted straight. Now, the mother did not use crystals. She found, particularly for the vibration of the psychic, the flowers were the most receptive, because the flowers represent in nature the psychic consciousness. If you took the leaf, took the stem, they would represent certain gradations of life force. But the flowers represent the psychic consciousness in the life force of the plant. And therefore, when she wanted to transmit, of course, the life force is the carrier to some extent. But to transmit the psychic vibration, the flowers were the most receptive substance, which was the basis for the blessing packet having dried rose flowers. But to those to whom she gave in the ashram, she gave a flower itself, not drying it up. Into the flower she infused a certain content, a certain spiritual force, even a certain experience, and then gave to that person. Now the benefit of that, and this is important to understand, let's say you go to the mother, I have this problem, I am miserable, etc. Okay, it's typically the way many people would go. I am so unhappy, I have so many problems. At the moment when you are meeting her, you're so busy with your misery that even when she gives you the force, you are unable to receive. Because you're so attached to that. And you want basically her to give you a physical caress like she would do to children and say, don't worry, I'll take care and it's not your problem and so on. Then you feel good, oh, my mom caressed me. But did you actually open to her spiritually? On the other hand, when she gave you the flower and gave you the caress perhaps, when she gave you the flower, you came away with the flower, now relieved of your misery perhaps to some extent. You held the flower. You kept it in your room in a vase, and it continued to radiate the help which she had infused through the next 24 hours or maybe longer when you're more receptive. So the question really is of how it is transmitted, and when you use a medium like this, the medium should be able to hold the force and not lose it in evaporation. It should be subtle enough, refined enough, in this case for the psychic vibration, and then for you to have it with you in a sustained release over the next 24 hours. You see, there are medicines you take, it hits your bloodstream immediately. There are medicines you take which have a sustained release over many hours. It's something like that. And the flower is one of the best vehicles for this grade of transmission. But as I said, crystals can be very useful for a certain grade of life force into which you can put the spiritual force, or even a mental grade of force. And different types of crystals tend to align to different gradations of life force, not spiritual primarily, upon which you can infuse a spiritual force. So again, don't make the mistake of thinking, oh, this crystal is good for this spiritual. No. Crystals are all to do with vital energies, primarily, into which a spiritual force could be put. So I'm pointing out to grade of substance, including in the body of a person. So I digressed a bit, but the receptivity of the substance to that grade of consciousness, and the human body, of course, is one of the most amazing, and therefore the value given to nails and hair or bones as relics of those who have embodied the spiritual consciousness materially. Not all do that. Again, remember, there's a big difference. Sometimes, and I've seen this with certain, let's say, monks of certain traditions, where they may have been great, but what remains in terms of relics is kind of empty, or has at best the devotion of the people who come to it. So then the frequency of use, and then the difference of intent and attention paid and energetic immersion. So if you've slept on a bed, let's say the saint, spiritual person has slept on a bed for a long time, of course that tends to absorb. Which grade? Well, the grade in which the person was during sleep. If they used to be in a state of samadhi and a spiritual samadhi, well, some imprint of that will be there. There's a very interesting example of this. The swing on which Sri Aurobindo sat when he had his experience of the nirvanic consciousness. 3 days he was in that. That swing, the house in which it took place was broken, but that swing was saved by someone and is presently kept in Baroda in the Sri Aurobindo Center, and you can feel a presence there. In that room, as a consequence of this swing also, but I had this very distinct experience sitting there, and as I opened to the presence, it pulled into this kind of a, I will say, in the quality or direction of the nirvanic grade of experience. Very specific. And that was imprinted there. Why? Because he sat on it for 3 days during that sustained practice and immersion in the nirvanic state. So, did he intend to infuse? Probably not. But it happened as a consequence. So, yes, frequency of use, closeness will make a difference, but much more important is the degree of attention paid. So when the mother took the blessing packet, which by itself would have been hollow, empty, paper and rose petal, she put an intent. What she put into it within a few seconds would be as powerful or more powerful even for what she wanted to transmit. So understand, finally it will be intent more than just familiarity and frequency of use. Even Sri Aurobindo makes this comment that if physical closeness was necessary or would lead spontaneously to physical transformation or spiritualization, then he said the table on which I am sitting and writing would be the first to be transformed. Obviously that's not the case. The table cannot receive or be transformed because it's not able to for a spiritual grade. So this is a broad background for relics of spiritual people, and why, how, to what extent they may or may not carry spiritual content. And so now we come to the perhaps more important part, which is the relics of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. And incidentally, I'm going to expand this because Narad will have more to say. Sacred objects used by them, or objects used by them which are sanctified therefore, and also objects or things in which a presence was invoked, particularly in this case the service tree of the ashram, which has a special presence, and in certain cases animals, cat, dog, with whom mother experimented to bring a spiritual force in them, or with computers when she tried to infuse a force. So this is the broad now topic we will come to. Narad, now let's hear what stories you want to share.
This blessing packet is 63 years old, and I can still feel the mother's presence in it. But I've shown it to very, very few people. Maybe in 63 years, 2 or 3 people. And I don't know if I infuse anything in it myself, because all I do is invoke the presence into it when I touch it again, and it's there. I've been given some gifts over the years of things that Mother wore, such as her chain that I keep around my neck, and her fingernail and a bit of her hair in this locket. And I don't feel that anything has ever lessened in any way at all. It's my receptivity that's the problem, not what is there in the object itself. And I guess thirdly, I was given from a disciple who was much beloved, a sari that Mother wore for many years. And I don't really even touch it very often, very rarely. I just stand before it and offer my soul. Those are just a few things. I could say many more things about the ashram itself, but I won't do that tonight.
Feel free though, Narad, just share whatever you feel at this moment. We have the time. So,
when I
yes.
first met Mother, maybe it was the second or third meeting, Mother gave me 5 flowers. And when I brought them down to these young people who were about my age, early 20s, they said, "Oh, Mother has given you such beautiful and powerful forces." And they named each flower, and I understood exactly what I needed and Mother had given me. Each flower. And when I would bring a flower to Mother, she would examine it very carefully, but very often she would not give it a significance. She would return it to me, and the force that with which she returned it to me was far greater than anything I could imagine in that flower. One was the sticks that are used for the I Ching. And Mother was very interested when I talked to her about that. But when she gave it back, but you see, that could have been just in her presence also. And I can't delineate it so clearly. Because when you're in the Mother's presence, you're almost in the transcendence. At least that was my feeling. When I would approach her room and enter her room, there were no walls. The room was as vast as eternity. And it took me a long time to get to the mother. And now I see that it's 2 steps. That's enough for tonight.
Yes, it's interesting about the I Ching. Those who might not know about it, it's a system, a Chinese system of predicting things. And I suppose you would have explained to the mother what it's used for.
Yes.
But when she gave it back to you with the presence infused into it, it's considered very important for purpose of prediction. When you're using physical tools like this for prediction, the quality of consciousness infused into the tool makes a huge difference on the quality and accuracy of what is perceived or transmitted. So, if for example an I Ching has been, that's the sticks, has been infused by somebody's consciousness of a lower grade, and you try to use that to gain an accurate insight of whatever question it is that you have, that particular vibration which is holding it would make it resonate with a lower grade of knowledge or influence, even, and including even a negative influence perhaps, which could interfere in the actual perception. Let me put it another way. Let's take a negative case. It's been infused with a negative energy of somebody's anger, hatred, upset. And so when you roll the things like dice, the quality of consciousness being of that grade, any force of that grade could actually infuse an influence to give an outcome, to give an indication which has been, so to say, hacked by the lower being. Okay? If it has been spiritually infused, as in this case by the mother when she gave it back to you and you felt the force, you can't have a lower grade hack. Rather, when you play it like dice to get a perception of or indication, it would be more naturally tuned to a higher grade of vibration and perhaps more accurate, or a higher grade of knowledge that it would transmit when you did a reading. So very often in those traditions which do this kind of use physical objects for fortune telling, they need to protect the actual object used and maintain its spiritual purity if the goal is to tap into a higher grade of knowledge. Of course, if it's the usual thing of when will I make money, when do I get married, or when will my problems be solved, then anything is okay. It doesn't really matter. But this is an interesting observation. Also, perhaps, Narad, you can share with us, when you felt she gave you back the flower and it was full, how long did it last? Could you feel it in your room like a radiating center?
As long as I held it, I felt it. And that was quite a bit of time. Because I came down from Mother, I went to the friends. I kept holding the bouquet because I knew it was so important. And that was long before I learned so much more about the messages of the flowers. I mean, I was very young. I only had learned a little bit about how Mother had named the flowers and how they came to her, and so many things I learned through because of Mother's touch.
And when you had it in your room, you probably kept it in a vase.
Yes.
Were you conscious that it continues to radiate?
I was so young, I don't remember. But I do remember one time, I always knelt down at Mother's feet and I placed my head on her feet. And one day when I was showing her this flower, the man who was with me said, "Put your head in Mother's lap." First time I ever did it. And Mother put her hands around my head. And I can't say anymore.
I think all of us would have felt when Narad narrated and with the gesture the force of what he received, or at least a touch of that force. And that's a beautiful example of how it can be held and transmitted. In this case, in the body of Narad, in the memory of the experience, which is a living experience, and when narrated, he becomes the vehicle for its transmission. And it doesn't matter if we are anywhere on the earth, through the video call, through the internet link, independent of this, that force is touching.
Just want to say one thing about the Om Choir, because Tuesday night we had 80 people come, and 20 of them were Korean ladies studying sound. And at the end, when I was meeting everyone, this lady came up to me pouring tears, couldn't say a word, just poured tears. And I have so many experiences with people, so many letters from people about their experiences through the power of Om. It's extraordinary. Just if we can form that word, that sound properly, and no longer be singers but instruments, and allow the divine presence to pour through this collective body. And I do that more and more because we need it especially now at this time, at this crux that we are facing. And we are 9 days away from Trump being president.
For those of you who are interested to form circles of the Om Choir, we have instructions on Narad's website. Narad, would you like to say how they can get
Mother and Sri Aurobindo, YouTube, and Mother and Sri Aurobindo.in.
Yes.
It used to be called the Sri Aurobindo Ashram website, but that was taken away from me by the trustees.
Yes. Yes. So we're looking at the relics of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. In this case, objects which were formed part of their body, nail, hair. We don't have bones, but that would be the case in other examples. Objects used by them, particularly the table, the bed Sri Aurobindo used, or these have now been some of the earlier ones, which before the new bed came in Sri Aurobindo's room, his older bed was kept. Now this is the interesting thing. When things used by them were replaced, the old one were not thrown away, they were not discarded. Fortunately, they were kept. Now we have cases where things were thrown away, and it's a pity. A good example is once during the evening talks, one of Sri Aurobindo's tooth broke, and he took it out and gave it to Purani. Purani took it and threw it out of the window. It was a gift. I've mentioned this perhaps. Humanity is receptivity. Champaklal, on the contrary, preserved everything, even to a fault, one could say. And there are things I've seen there which he has kept, which later many of them were removed, but things he had preserved, anything used by the Mother, touched by the Mother, even casually. One of the friends I know has handkerchiefs that the Mother used once to wipe and then gave it to that person. And just that, casually. And the Mother herself gave it, knowing the value of what it contained because of that and the transmission intended. So casually, she wipes in her lips or face and then gave it to that person. If the person recognized its spiritual value, well, they kept it, and so it's there. But if you didn't recognize even Sri Aurobindo's tooth, you could just throw out and lose whatever potential it could carry. So I'm giving a variety of examples. So Sri Aurobindo's bed, for example, is kept in the Sri Smriti, which is the museum of objects used by the mother and Sri Aurobindo. And when you go there with a certain opening and intention, aspiration, it's almost like, in a diluted version, almost like visiting Sri Aurobindo's room or the mother's room, because the objects are so suffused. It's also important that people who maintain that space also protect it and hold the aspiration. I've seen at one point when I was visiting there, just to feel that presence, a group of tourists came, and there was the tourist guide, and he was talking loudly in the most casual way. Oh, Aurobindo used this, Aurobindo did that, and you could feel it was like a wave of contrary mixed vibrations flowing through, and then they went out. Once they went out again, the presence came back and settled. And I'm describing this so that you become conscious of the presence more than an object. Remember, an object is only as valuable as the presence that it carries. Spiritually, I mean. Of course, it can trigger associations and all that. Yes, that has a value. But still, the triggered association as a spiritual association, yes, that would be useful. But in the long run, it's always the spiritual content which we look at. So objects used by the mother and Sri Aurobindo. And I will actually conclude with a passage of what the mother said regarding those objects. But there are also books that mother signed, letters that she wrote and signed. Or at one point, the accounts books of the ashram, she signed on each page. And there, each of these things was done with a certain intent and a force put. When money was sent to the mother during the Second World War, the mother signed the money order receipt herself for each one. Even for a small amount, for example, that somebody sent a small amount, each she would sign. And my teacher, M.P. Pandit, was the person who was taking these documents to her as mother's secretary. And he said that it was unusual for them to see the mother taking so much trouble, but it was a way for her to give acknowledgement for the smallest amounts that came, but also send back a blessing in response as a gesture of gratitude for all those who had sent the money. So again, for her, it was not the quantum, it was the vibrational quality with which it was sent. So when she signed, it was with an intent put. It was not casual. So there you have a certain vibrational quality, very important. And this is the part which sometimes I feel very pained when I hear that in the accounts books of the ashram, she signed each page. In detail, you will see down to a rupee and a paisa, things had been totaled, and she would sign. She would check, she would sign. And for years she did that. So these books were kept. At some point, somebody in charge says, hey, what's the use of all these books? We only want mother's signature. They cut out mother's signature and gave away those pieces of paper, destroyed the books. No, it was not mother's signature put in the air for giving away. It was put for a purpose on the finances, for activating the money power and its flow and building that relationship for the ashram. Now, if anybody had the deeper spiritual, occult perception, value, sensitivity, whatever it is, those books would be kept carefully in the accounts section if needed, or in a space which should correspond to the place from where the money flows are managed, let's say. Because there's an intention she put specifically for that purpose, hold that. And even if you can hold that for a few centuries, 100 years, 200 years, it would have a value because she infused with that value those signatures. You take that out, cut it off from its purpose, and you distribute it as pieces of paper that mother has signed, and sometimes those are easily lost, and the value is very different. So I'm giving here an example of how one could use what she did and continue to hold that. I'm going to go a little further, deeper still. Let's say even this has been damaged. That formation that she infused, one can still tap into and invoke that into a space. Because what she infused, being a spiritual power, resonates through eternity, resonates through infinity. You can tap into that, invoke that, hold it in your space. clothes worn by the mother, sometimes slippers that she wore once and then gave. A sari somebody had embroidered for her, she wore once, the person gifted on mother's birthday, mother wore once and then it was given away. It doesn't matter how many times. The intent to manifest, to hold in the physical substance has a transmission. So, when relics of Sri Aurobindo and the mother were given, mothers not normally, but when relics of Sri Aurobindo the mother gave, it was with very clear specific instructions that they were to be embedded in the earth because the consciousness had to be fixed in the earth, in matter. So she gave certain preferences. She said in a space where people can assemble, where people can sit, but open to the air, not closed. Generally she preferred that it should be in the open, as the samadhi is open, and in marble, but 3 layers. So if I remember right, you first put the hair or the nail in a box which is made of gold, not gold coated, actual gold, but thin, beaten perhaps gold box. And then around that silver, around that rosewood, if I remember right. That would then be given to the person to take to the place where the relics are to be installed, and then there in marble or stone it was put and covered to be treated as a samadhi. These were generally her instructions. There may be more, but this is broadly what I recall. Goal is very clear: to fix that vibration on a material level in that space to be made accessible for a larger number of people. So once long ago, to one of the persons who was in the management in the ashram, I said, but then have you protected, have you kept enough of the relics for every country on earth and every state in India? And he looked at me as if I was crazy. They had not even thought about it. So again, if you have a larger view, you will and understand what import this has, one would deal with it very differently. Earlier it used to be that there would be one center with relics in one city. And then at some point it became a matter of prestige. So you had sometimes one place with the relics, and barely 200 meters away somebody else brought the relics and installed. And it's almost becomes like a competing center of light. It made sense if for a very large city you have it on 2 extremes because people can't travel for an hour or 2, that makes sense. But to have it in one nearby space, that should not have been done. Because you have to understand, this is not a prestige issue, it is a spiritual focal point. You don't create 2 relic centers in one same building. It's silly. You don't put 2 flames, it's one focal point. So yes, you may have another focal point at a much greater distance. This should have been thought out, this should have been worked out by people who had the sensitivity. I believe those who were the early disciples did have the sensitivity. Those who have subsequently taken over do not have it. But again, I'm pointing to this principle because I hope in future, if somebody has the necessary sincerity, perhaps things would be done correctly. But placing it in the earth because the goal was to embody, to fix in matter. This being the objective of the yoga itself. So the linking of the highest spiritual to the material. There are people, Narad has shared this, they have put it on the necklace or they have put in their house. That's a different thing. But if you put it in a necklace, and at one point there were many who had received that, not all took the trouble to maintain its sanctity. It's a huge responsibility to maintain the sanctity. You don't want your vibrations to overwhelm that. You don't want that to feel oppressed by contrary vibrations of a life that you may live, which is contrary to that. It's not like a good luck charm. It's not like a get more money charm. It's a spiritual power, and if you do not maintain the necessary purity, it could even overwhelm somebody, or the power itself, in order not to overwhelm, might withdraw. And such would be the case in many that I have seen for people who have worn. What is interesting though is after the person has stopped using it, it's kept aside. If the thing is again invoked in prayer, with reverence, the presence again grows and reactivates. So all depends on your receptivity and the purity with which you maintain. But this is something which one has to be very careful. It's not something trivial you play with. There were cases where the mother gave an object infused with a consciousness for a purpose. So Pranabdha narrated this. At some point when he needed money, she took a coin, I don't know if it's a 1 rupee coin of that time, and she infused the money power force and then gave it to him and asked him to keep it with him always. And she says, as long as you have that, you'll never have a lack for money. Now this is a very clear transmission with a certain object. And it can be transmitted to an object. It's a relic. It's not a part of the nail or hair, but it has her consciousness with that particular force, aspect, purpose. So there were things like that she did with, I know of several people who received such things. But those you would be careful not to put in the hands of a dozen or 100 or 1,000 people, because one could easily contaminate or weaken the nature of that. One would keep it protected with that intention. There is also the sacredness which comes with the sacred service tree in the ashram, which, as you know, is a conscious being, spiritual being, a highly evolved being who has as if embodied or incarnated in the body of this tree. I don't know if you'd like to share something, Narad, about this or your personal experience with this. You'll have to unmute.
Yes. It was 1972 when the first great branch of the service tree broke. It was directly on the south side. And I was going by and I saw the young men cutting the tree in the wrong way, in which the whole tree would have been stripped, or at least a large part of it, and could easily have died. The bark would have been totally stripped away. And I asked Parichan if I could go up and help. And I did. And we cut it from the bottom, as one has to, 1/3 of the way, and then from the top down. And the branch broke, the stub broke very perfectly. You can see that today it's also very evident that everything healed. Now, the moment I finished, and I mean the moment I finished, Parichan came running to me and said, Mother has given you this blessing packet to care for the tree for the rest of your life. Of course, that was taken away from me, but I won't go into that. I did care for it for 37 years, and I care for it today from within, because when I go up to it, I feel the force that has protected and shaded millions of people as they came to the Samadhi. There is no more important tree in the whole world, and this tree cannot be allowed to die for many, many lives. I ask it to remain for thousands of years. The second most important, of course, is the banyan that Mother named as the physical center of Oroville. I want to share one thing about Savitri. I did a couple of interviews with Shobha, and she showed me the book of Savitri with Mother's signature, to Savitri. And the second one is one of my most sacred books. It's Savitri that was given to Huta for all the work she was doing. And here is that Savitri with Mother's signature. Imagine, that's the only two I know, that books of Savitri that Mother ever signed. So I share that with you today.
Thank you. Regarding the service tree, when recently, I think it was in 2010 or 11, when there was a big storm and a huge branch broke. You remember when that happened in 1971 or so with the storm? The mother had said that it was a reflection of the state of collective consciousness of the ashram community, and that's what made it possible.
That was the branch I cut.
That's right.
72.
72. And so when this happened in 2010, I believe, again, a huge branch broke. It was actually a sad thing, just to show you how much worse it has become. From the management side of the ashram management, as I've said, some of them are hostile to Sri Aurobindo and the mother. There was even a statement publicly put out that this tree has anyway a 30-40 year lifespan. If it's dying, let it die. What's the big deal? They actually said this, and I was very sad to hear. And I remember at that point, Narad you had the experience of communication with the tree, and then we were all very sad, and Narad held the tree, and there was an experience you had, and then you came back and you told me the tree will survive, and you knew it from the communication you had received. I don't know if you want to share something of that.
Well, actually what happened was that I had met, I'm telling things that I've not told others, so I can be at risk here, but that's fine. I'm old enough to accept that. I met with Vishwanath, and I told him the top branches, that's the big break that happened, are going to break. And we will have to build something similar, almost identical to what Mother designed for the lower trees, these columns that she designed. And so we went together to the trustees and presented the drawing. And I told them, you must do this because there's going to be a huge break in the top of the tree. And it was huge. And they thanked us and never did anything. Now, the break did happen. And it was so severe, it was possible that the tree could have died. And I prayed to Mother, and I went to the managing trustee, and I said, do not let these people who have no feeling for the tree begin cutting it. Let me bring the professionals trained by a wonderful man, Juan from Spain, and we will work all day and night to prune the tree and save it. And they did. And I worked with him. It was the last time I was able to climb the tree. And their work was so beautiful. And they did it all voluntarily. And we saved the tree. But I've heard recently, I don't know if it's absolutely true, but I've heard on good authority that it has become a historic tree for India. And the government has put wires to hold it in place, and cables. So I hope that's true, that it will be considered a sacred tree that no one can touch. We'll see.
Yes.
We'll see.
We'll see. But I also want to point out that not everybody who handles the tree has the same sensitivity as Narad has. And finally, it's a question of a spiritual sensitivity. I remember at one point, it was soon after this big storm, that somebody was up on the tree and hacking away. And you could feel the pain of the tree. It was a loud sound because he was hacking literally, and chop, chop. And Kumud Ben, who was Mother's personal attendant, she felt the pain so deeply. She finally came to the side terrace of the ashram, and shouted at the person, "Stop this, you're killing the tree." And he refused to listen. He went on. Finally, with her shouting, he stopped and went. But it's just to show you that at the end of the day, these are precious relics from a spiritual point of view. And if the people who handle them do not have the sensitivity, one can do a lot of spiritual damage. And for
I
them,
want
of
to
course,
add one.
yes.
I want to add one more thing because it was about Kumud, and I think it's important that I share this. I was kneeling in 6 inches of water by the Samadhi, at least 6 inches, maybe 8 inches of water during that storm. And I was weeping. And a lady comes and she said, Kumud would like to see you. So I went to Kumud. She said, you're soaking wet. Let me give you my shirt. This is no longer a time to cry, but to fight. I understood. We have to fight.
And the fight is to protect the spiritual gifts, the
Yes,
spiritual presence.
yes.
The physical symbols are containers at best. And it is that which we have to be conscious of. So I come again to this example of the tree because there are also other kinds which can, and very unusual but very rare, where the mother experimented with some dogs and cats in the early years in the 1930s, during the time when the supramental consciousness was being infused into the vital particularly. And the cats and dogs had been, I would say, let's say, infused or awakened to whatever extent they could. And of course, there are consequences to an experiment like this. Suppose they had continued to stay, eventually they would have bred, eventually they would have had children, and people would have attached to the descendants in the form of the cats and dogs, and not to the presence that was infused in them. And so, to end this, to prevent such a thing from happening, we were told that the mother, when the cats had a litter of children, the mother had those cats, well, put away. And so it ended that whole possibility. But otherwise, you can imagine what a story it would be. You know, the descendants of the cats that the mother had experimented with or blessed, and it would have been a big story in itself. She saw that potential and stopped it. But there are other examples of relics also which are indirect. In the place where Sri Aurobindo used to walk when he was in the guest house in the playground during the time of the record of yoga, and he would be walking in a place where the bricks were the base, the traditional roof. He was walking back and forth for hours together every day, to such an extent that a groove had formed. The bricks had got worn out where he was walking. And afterwards, when he shifted to the main ashram building, that groove remained for decades. I believe it was in the 1970s, after the mother had left her body, that some maintenance person in the ashram department said, hey, what's this? This is worn out and old. Let's just replace it. And they filled it with cement. So it's one of those really stupid things one could do, but it can only be done by somebody who has absolutely no spiritual sensitivity. Yes, we have people like that in the ashram. We have people like that everywhere, and maybe the majority might be less sensitive today, as it used to be in the past. Majority were more sensitive. I don't know. But this kind of thing has been done also. It's such a sad thing. Champaklalji was the very opposite, as I said. He preserved every single thing, and it's quite remarkable. I happened to receive, when they were discarding things which he had preserved, I happened to receive a few things which had been kept there by him for whatever reason. It included certain corals and even some mosquito mats which were used for Sri Aurobindo at the time. So they had been bought for him. And of course, after Sri Aurobindo left his body, those mosquito mats stayed. So one of them was given to me because they didn't know what to do. They just wanted to throw it away. Would you have kept it? Now, this is one of those questions, and I'm going back to the question of our friend who raised this whole thing. And it's one of those difficult questions you would ask. Would you keep those, or would you discard them at a certain point? Maybe not immediately after Sri Aurobindo had left his body, but all the more reason after it had been kept there for 50 years, in that space, suffused with that atmosphere, would you discard it? Would you give it away? what would you do? It's one of those very difficult questions. I don't have a simple answer. But what I can say is when I received that, for me it was a treasure, it was precious, and I kept it. Someone might have taken it and say, yes, I'm going to burn it and use it actually for the purpose for which it was meant. I don't know. But for me, it was somehow valuable that we kept it. I give another example. When the mother used to come out from the back gate of the ashram, they would walk on the footpath of the ashram. She would walk, Sri Aurobindo has walked on that footpath. For years, decades, mother has walked there, and she would go to the car or whatever work had to be done. So at some point, the government of Pondicherry, I don't know what centenary it was, centenary of something, of the Sri Aurobindo's or mother's arrival or something. And they decided that they wanted to replace the ashram's footpath with something very ugly and crude, with bricks of cement. Now, it is the responsibility of the ashram management to say, no, we do not want you to destroy something which is precious for us. But because you had insensitive people working with insensitive people, everything was done the way the government wanted to. They just broke the footpath of the ashram, put these very ugly cement bricks upon sand. They dug out 1/2 meter of material soaked with the presence, threw it out, and replaced with fresh river sand and these bricks. The entire presence, which was soaked in the substance, was thrown away. The place where mother had invoked the highest spiritual force during the darshans, it was soaking in the road, public road. You could walk on that part of the road and feel the presence and still feel that descent. All that was dug to 1 meter depth and filled with river sand and these ugly bricks, and the precious material thrown away. I went there, I was helpless, I was almost weeping, and they were digging the ashram footpath at the back, and I said, here are the flagstones. They were black stone where mother had walked. And I knocked on Nirod Bharan's window and I said, they're going to throw away all these stones with where mother has walked. And he looked at me with a blank look and just shook his head and then went away. Then finally I went to Kumudban, and Kumudban instructed me, hey, preserve these stones. They didn't. As far as I know, they did not. But what I did, I took a couple of those stones and took some of the soil from there, just in front where she walked, and put that in a little box. I still have that. Bricks and soil, and this was soil, the stones. And another time from Sri Aurobindo's room, on the outer border of Sri Aurobindo's room, they chipped in for strengthening the structure. I don't remember what it was, and then they made a very ugly flat cement coating, where earlier there was this very beautiful curved shape. I don't know why they couldn't have done the curved shape. Anyway, so the pieces they broke, I took some of those bricks and stone with limestone plaster, and I preserved those. So again, someone might look at that and say, what a crazy thing. But to me, in terms of the sentiment and the value of the presence that it held, I don't know if I can feel the presence, but the fact that it was an integral part of the Sri Aurobindo's room or where mother stepped, for me that was precious enough to keep, and so I kept it. So this is an example again of what we would still use the word relics, but what would you do? How far would you go? And it's one of those questions where I don't have a simple answer. I'm going to look at the chat box. There's some very interesting observations and questions. So somebody called Ocean says, Saint Nityananda had done an infusion of his own intention for the place of his samadhi to keep it free of politics in having darshan. Yes, there are people who have done that. They have consciously infused a presence either as they went into samadhi, or some of them went into samadhi in a conscious waking state with the object of holding a higher or deeper presence, infusing it and settling there. Even if they were in an ascetic path, if the goal was to infuse and fix in matter, yes, that has a tremendous value. Of course, the quality of consciousness they embodied would then be the imprint there and what that represents. This still works, as Ocean points out. Yes, it still works. Pratik is asking, has just scrolled out. He's asking, have there been any instructions given by the mother regarding these things, guidelines for preservation? None that I know of. I don't think they wanted to make a fetish of the whole thing. It was more a question of the value a person had for these things. And so I would simply leave it at that. V-Truth is asking, what about Rudraksha? Now these are fruits from a particular tree sacred to Shiva and dried, and sometimes depending on the patterns they have, they are given more or less value or different kinds of qualitative values. The Rudraksha itself is not suffused with the spiritual force. But the reason it is considered to be sacred is because it is capable of infusing or holding a spiritual force of a particular kind of vibration aligned to Shiva. So therefore it is called as Shiva's favorite and so on. So there are various plants, flowers, fruits or crystals associated with certain qualities or aspects of the divine or certain deities, and because of that affinity they are considered sacred for that particular quality of consciousness. Now here is where I make a distinction, as with the temple, where by certain occult process you invoke a force. What you invoke is specific to the quality invoked and stays with that. That's why it's a occult spiritual formation, and it needs to be renewed. And I distinguish this from a purely spiritual presence, as you see in the case of the Samadhi in the ashram or the Matre Mandir, where nothing formal was given, no object was given. Mother simply said, build it, and I take it upon myself to make it one of the most powerful centers, spiritual centers on earth. You had to do nothing, you just build it, and from that side, from above, she is infusing the force, and you can see the force building up. It's still building year to year. So you understand, in a spiritual center, an occult process, a measurement is non-critical. A ritual is non-critical, but maintenance of the purity is essential. Whereas in a temple where there's an occult process, you may not maintain purity because of the number of people who come with their devotions, and they have an inbuilt system of re-purifying this. So every 12 years they will do a ritual of purification. But in the core sanctum sanctorum, the purity has to be maintained, and the priests who have to deal with the deity have to follow a very strict pure life, should not do certain things, can only do certain things, etc., to hold the purity associated with the deity. Again, the rules may vary according to the deity. But the core being held, the rest then can be exposed to the public and even allowed to be invaded. Now the same principle applies in a spiritual place. Let's take the example of the Samadhi, where the force is able to regenerate itself, but you do not need to purify because it's not an occult structure, it's a purely spiritual focal point. But it can be diluted, it can be dimmed by an influx of contrary vibrations, which is what happens when you have a horde of tourists who come wandering around, sometimes talking, doing crazy things. I once walked in and I found next to the Samadhi there was a whole tourist group of students of some architecture tour, and the architectural head was giving a lecture sitting next to the Samadhi, and I went up to her and I said, what are you doing? Are you conscious that this is a spiritual space? You're not supposed to speak here, it's a place for meditation. She said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. It was empty, so we sat down and decided to have our discussion here. So yes, these things do dilute, but the beauty of the spiritual power is that it can, when the dilution is removed, it bounces back, pushes back, rebuilds. How far? Again, depends on how much dilution is imposed on it. So there was a time when you could feel the presence 2 or 3 blocks away. Now with the influx of tourists, especially the kind of dilution that happens during the New Year's Eve and all that, you can feel the range of dilution is now, well, the range is let's say, you can feel the dilution happening much sooner than it used to be. But that's why we have to be conscious. We have to protect this. What you have to do, well, do what you have to in your space, wherever you have these things. So I've digressed a little bit, but V-Truth also says Darshan Day card had a similar soothing effect. Yes, Mother explained that the Darshan card was sent with a printed message that she would choose, and she said it was a way of physically transmitting the spiritual force. That is, the force is infused in the card and is sent with that infusion. Now, it so happened, again, I want to share this as examples of what not to be done. It's useful to understand. Earlier, all the cards would be taken to the mother's room, kept there overnight, and then sent for distribution. At some point, some smart alec in the administration said, let's be more efficient. So a week before the darshan or the new year, from the press, they would send the cards directly in bulk to various centers and tell them open on that day. It's not the same thing. From a spiritual point of view, from the force point of view, it's not the same thing. Taking it to the mother's room first, infusing the presence, and then sending it had a different value than sending straight from the press. And the mother herself commented on this. You'll find this in the agenda where she says, I don't know if it's in the agenda, but it was told to me by one of the person who was heading the ashram press. Maybe it's in the agenda also. But he told me this personally because he was involved directly. In the early days, it was her specific rule. All the books of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, once printed, would be brought to her room. She would concentrate on them and then they would be taken for the sales. What did she do? She infused the force. What's the difference when you read a book which is infused with force and a book without force? There's a difference. And the difference is when you read or when you hold the book. And I've said this many times perhaps, that when you hold a book that has been printed before 1960, let's say, you can feel the force even now because she's infused it and the force stays. When you open and read, it goes in differently. You understand differently, you absorb differently, it goes deeper. It has a spiritual transmission of the experiential content of what you're reading, which is more powerful than if you just took a later printed book. Of course, you could do the same thing. Take the book, invoke the mother's presence, invoke Sri Aurobindo's presence. When you open it, attune yourself to their presence and you will get the same effect. So, the importance is of the presence infused and it makes a huge difference. It's not just printed text that's being sold. It's a presence and an experience that's being transmitted through the books. Understand this difference. If you understand it, you know what you have to do. So, Darshan Day card is similar. And the people who stopped the card did it with a hostile intent to cut that link. Be conscious of this. Know that the game is being played to cause harm in this transmission. Do what is required to reverse it when you can, whenever possible. Chendok is asking how to have protection from adverse forces and black magic. I'll put it in this context. So often what is done is for protection you have a sacred object. And equally a non-sacred object could be used to attack. But protection would be through a sacred object indirectly. But the best way is if within you can embody, hold something of the spiritual presence, that's the automatic protection. Any negative force would simply bounce back. This is the principle generally. Or you invoke in you, in the space where you feel the attack is taking place, and it will have an effect. There's an interesting comment from Revati. She says when she does the guided meditation sessions, she used to use a particular plastic chair for almost a year. Then she started using a different chair. She says, I didn't feel the same efficacy. When I started using the old one, things became better again. Now I'm able to meditate with satisfaction irrespective of the location and chair. But I treat the chair with a lot of respect. I want to point to this. This is very valuable and it's the same principle being used. When you sit in a particular place and invoke the presence, it is held in the substance of the chair, in that space, sometimes even at that time. And when you sit in that space, on that chair, at that time, you feel a difference. It's a question of experience, as Revati has found. When you switch chairs suddenly, you will not have the same build-up. So remember, it's the build-up of substance of the presence. Become conscious of this. So I'm going to take it a little farther. What if your old chair is now damaged? You have to break or discard it. What happens to the presence built up? You can transfer it into the new one. Consciously. Feel it, absorb it, intend it, and transmit it into the new one. Sit on the new one with the presence that you hold and fix it there. It's as simple as that. You don't need a ritual. Rituals do the same process by an indirect mechanical process. Do it consciously and you'll have the same result. I give the example of another person. She shared this experience. She was in the house she was living in. She had built up a strong presence with the meditation, and it was spread into the whole house. Then she had to shift house. And she said, since I've shifted, I don't have the same presence, I don't have the same support. So I find it difficult to meditate. I said, didn't you consciously transfer from that house to the new one? She said, it didn't strike me. It did not strike me. Become conscious of it. The presence itself, fixed in a space or attached to an object, associated with an object, is not bound to the object. You can consciously transfer it into the new space. And again, once you get the feel of what it's like, what I'm trying to say, you will be able to do it on your own. So, it's a very interesting observation. So, educating is saying, what about the Turin shroud? Is it a good example of a spiritual tattoo? I'm not too sure it has to do with a tattoo. There are, of course, people who say that it's a fake. There are others who say it's genuine. It's not so important. If it is genuine, then some imprint of the influence of the Christ consciousness that he held in that state when he was put in the shroud might be transferred into the shroud. If it is a fake, and it's a well-made fake, then the fact that people revere it could be enough to already bring a certain focus of energetic, emotional or other vibrational content. But it need not be spiritual in that case. But if the Christ himself lay on it, Jesus lay on it for that period, what state he was in at that time might be infused along with the imprint that is made there. Chandok says, is this the same as Shakuni controlling the dice during the tournament? Does that mean matter is programmable? Yes, this is going back to the example of the I Ching, where you roll like dice. That was in fact the method used. Shakuni used, I believe it was the bones of his ancestors for purpose of revenge. So, it need not be bone, but it can be infused with vibration with a certain quality of consciousness to align for that purpose. Again, I'll give an example here. There are people who move objects with their focus. Look up on the internet, Nelia Mikhailova or another one, I forget the name now, 2 Russians, well documented, lots of videos also, photographs, where they would move objects. If you give them a fresh object and try to move, it's much more difficult. If they take that object in their hand, familiarize it as if infusing something of their consciousness, and then keep it and try to move, it's much easier. Why? You have infused with your subtle physical substance, built a continuity now with your subtle physical, and you're pushing it with your subtle physical. But because it's already got hooked with your subtle physical, the influence is easier. So that's the idea behind some of these kinds of things. So if you had dice which you have held in your hand, you'll see instinctively people do this. You give them fresh dice, they will roll in their hand as if infused with their consciousness, with their intention, and then roll. You're doing it instinctively, you're doing it unconsciously, but there is a purpose behind, there is a rationale which actually makes it work. The next person who takes again will roll as if to remove your influence and put their influence and then throw. So yes, these things do work. Matter can be infused with an intent, and if it is used for a process, the intent can influence the process. Pepito says, each cell of my body is activating. Yes, with spiritual force, it will affect your body. And that's, in fact, your body is your vehicle to receive, isn't it? So, SRJ is saying, books signed by Mother of Sri Aurobindo and given to people, what do you think of their sacredness? The signing itself was a way of infusing a purpose, a blessing. Signing a book particularly was to help transmit the content of the book, the experience that it carries. So yes, those have a value, tremendous value. But it does not mean that you are bound to have only a signed book. I would simply say now, take a fresh book, invoke the Mother's presence on it. If you like, physically place it on the Samadhi, Place it in the sacred space in your home. That's your samadhi. Invoke her. Invoke her with the intention that invoke the light of Sri Aurobindo. If it is Sri Aurobindo's book, ask his light, his knowledge, his force to fill it and to transmit to you what he wants to transmit through those words of the book. When you sit with that intention, it has a huge effect. The book itself, you will feel has a different quality. And then if you have read it and you have felt a certain transmission taking place when you read, here comes another problem with this whole relics idea. You don't want to give that book to others. It's my common experience, and many of you would have had this experience. Having used that book and received a certain transmission, when you give it to somebody else, it's as if you're mixing with their consciousness or diluting something of what is built up. Do not mix books. What you use for deep study, let it be yours. If you feel the difference. If you don't, it doesn't matter. You go to a library, borrow a book, read, put back. Someone else borrows, reads, puts back. Maybe it doesn't matter. But when you have done it, especially for purpose of sadhana, you read, you go deep, you read Savitri, your copy, you go deep, and there's a build-up of a certain intensity of experience with that book. You're actually holding in that book a certain imprint of what is received, transmitted, or invoked that you would not want to share. If you do, you will feel the dilution, you will feel the difference. If you take somebody else's book, you will feel their content in it. You don't want them to come in between. So in such a case, I would say buy a fresh book rather than used by somebody else, unless that person's vibration was helpful to you. So buy a fresh book and let the new vibration of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother be invoked in it. So with these examples, now I come to the last portion, which is relics of disciples. So if somebody has actually held and embodied a certain experience received from the Mother, in this case I am speaking now of my teacher, MP Pandit, and a book that he has used, or an object that he has used, and when he studied, when he read, and if I feel in those books that vibration, which to me, because I have a relationship with him, has also that value, but also I feel there is something infused by him through that process, which I could not do with my capacity, then I can take advantage of that also, isn't it? So I'm saying this is not the case with all disciples. Just as I said, not all spiritual teachers have a spiritual consciousness or may embody even the spiritual consciousness, even if they had it during a transmission. But the same would apply to many of the disciples of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. It's my experience that very few really held in their body a spiritual force. Those who did, you felt the difference. And in such cases, well, there is a difference. And so that would be the criteria for me, at least, of what is worth preserving, what is not. When you do have to discard an object, sometimes you have to, because that's the nature of life. It has crossed its utility. It needs to be discarded. It needs to be either given away or disposed of or recycled and so on. Then in such a case, what I would do, and I suggest on two levels, spiritually, if you feel there is a spiritual content held, you consciously, as I said, absorb into you or transfer into the spiritual space where you sit. Now, for example, there are books I've held where the cover has got torn and pieces, brittle pieces break away. I will try to protect the cover as much as possible, but the brittle pieces, I cannot accumulate them. If you do, even if you do, after a while it ceases to hold the presence, at least in my experience. What do? You have to throw it away. So in such a case, if you feel the presence, well, you say thank you, and then you release the physical object, retaining the presence. So there would be a method you could use to discard, and then there is the other part. Maybe I'll just come before the last part. I will finish the other questions and comments. Yes, so somebody has commented. Somebody says, Suraj says, once I visited Auroville and the ashram, and I saw the flowers, they were so rich with something that was filled in them. And even the furniture in Mother's room was so rich. Yes, you feel it. When you feel it and you respect it, the presence is nourished. And when you approach it with respect, the presence can even grow. So Verena is asking, are there relics in the Matri Mandir? No, nothing. As far as I know, nothing was given for the Matri Mandir. And only when the base was being built, I don't know if mother gave her blessings, but she was told what time it would start. It was purely done, as far as I know, with the spiritual force only. I don't know if something was placed, but certainly not relics of Sri Aurobindo. V-Truth says, while passing through the street where Sri Aurobindo's room's window is, I insist friends and relatives to maintain silence and reverence. That's the street where there's actually a very strong presence, because the mother's darshan used to be there. And there's still a presence there, but after they dug out 1 meter soil and threw it away and replaced with river sand, the physical lower layer has dimmed. Maybe it is going to be rebuilt, maybe slowly it fills, but in my experience, earlier you would feel the density all the way down to the feet. Now when I walk there, I feel the density all the way down to the hips, let's say, and then fades out as it approaches the legs, because the physical substance was removed. So it's as if on the higher part it is held, not tied to physical objects, so to say, it's in the space. Maybe it will permeate if we do that, if we go consciously, and as a group, as a collective, we stand to receive and invoke the presence of the darshan. Maybe again we can rebuild. So it's not that any hope is lost and something is gone forever. One can rebuild, but then you have to take the trouble. What she had already done, you should have taken advantage of. But if you lose it, you can always work to rebuild. Sumana is asking how to develop and increase sensitivity in one to receive and retain the force from sacred objects. By paying attention. First note, all of us have the sensitivity. You feel. At that point, you can start doubting. Maybe it's my imagination. Maybe I feel something, but is it real? Don't question. Feel the difference. Get familiar. Paying attention, you will notice more and more. And in time, the sensitivity will grow. Every time you pick up that object, that book, enter that space, notice, observe. As you approach the samadhi from a distance, notice the shift in vibes. At first, it's very fine, qualitative. Then it becomes more and more distinct and vivid. At one point, it hits you. Observe all the gradations. By paying attention, by observing, your sensitivity will grow. And this is the case for all sensitivities, including the spiritual, but even for other material sensitivities. Someone asks, I bought Savitri Savitri book in Savitri Bhavan. Can you consider this a presence? I don't know. Because very often it just goes from people to people. It's not done with an intention. What I would simply say is invoke the presence. If you're in Pondicherry, well, you place it at the Samadhi and invoke the presence. If you're at home anywhere, just place it before you, invoke Sri Aurobindo's presence. If you like, if you need a visual, invoke his light, visualize his light and force flowing down and filling the book and intensifying it. The visual can help you to hold attention, but also creates as if a link of a passage through which your aspiration will draw, invoke his force and build it. And you will feel the difference. So you do this, invoke, place it in your sacred space in the home, wherever it is, and go back to go for the night. Come back in the morning, approach that book. From a distance, observe. Very likely that movement begun will continue through the night. When you approach, you'll feel a difference. Do it for a few days if you want. Notice how it builds, and in that whole space where you're doing this exercise. Nikhil is asking how to shift the presence. Feel the presence, hold it within you, take it into the new space and infuse it. If you remember its substance, once you're conscious its substance, you deal with it as substance. But you feel the substance. When you feel, you hold it and carry it. It's very simple. Feel it. If you're conscious, that's all it needs. Take it. Sometimes you'll notice you take and you feel something is carried, but something is left behind. In the beginning, let that be transmitted anyway. Later you can come back. If you feel something left behind, again take, transfer. So So Sumana says, when I study synthesis of yoga nowadays, I start to have experiences similar to what I get during practice of descent of peace. Yes, the intention with those books is not just to describe with ideas, but to infuse through the idea a touch of the experience. So you will understand, and even where the understanding is partial, feel what is behind the understanding. And you'll feel a touch of the experience as if dawning into you. Feel that, hold that. So when you read, there are many levels you can read. You just stay with the words without understanding. Make effort to understand. Maybe you understand partially. Make effort to reread after a few days and you understand more completely. But notice behind that understanding what he's talking about as an experience is held. He holds it. It's there in the presence. It's there in the power of the words. Feel that, hold that. So after you have understood it, you feel it and then you kind of immerse. Sink into, drift back, lean back into the presence, stay with it. And that's a meditation. Where something of the experience now starts forming in you. And then you come back, read again or read the next day. All of Sri Aurobindo's and Mother's books are like this. There's a living force behind. Tap into that because that's the purpose of those books. It's not merely explanations and talking about things. So Sherukuri says, if we pray and treat as a living being, the book responds as a living being. Yes, but especially true for spiritual things. Not all books may have that spiritual content, but it taps into the grade of quality that the book has. Yes, it can be a living force for that grade of what it contains. Rabi says, how to feel the presence of Sri Aurobindo and Mother all the time? I would say you don't try initially for all the time. It's much more important to have a few moments of intense, one-pointed, exclusive immersion in the presence. And then relax. Let its imprint carry with you. Let it stay with you without effort, as long as it can. Then again, intense, concentrated immersion, and then let it continue. So, brief periods of full immersion, multiple times a day, is more valuable than struggling to hold presence all the time, which you can't do anyway, and you don't have depth, and it stays shallow and superficial. Go for depth multiple times when you're fresh. When you do that several times, something of that presence now touched deeply will suffuse and fill your day spontaneously. That's a much better way, much more rapid in terms of result also. So I'm going to now end with the last thing which I said. When you have to let go of things, of course you hold the spiritual content and you say goodbye. And this you will see Mother does in one of her prayers and meditations, dated March 3rd, 1914. Remember, this is the time when she is about to leave. I think it is from France to come to Pondicherry. And she's leaving behind objects. In those days, it's a several months journey. She's going to be in Pondicherry for many months. So she's leaving behind things which she may never see again. So I'll read the whole prayer and we will end with concentration in this theme itself with her prayer. As the day of departure draws near, I enter into a kind of self-communion. I turn with a fond solemnity towards all those 1,000 little nothings around us, which have silently for so many years played their role of faithful friends. All objects, they are faithful friends, and they are thousands of little nothings. Scraps of paper sometimes, little paperweight that you've used, a stone that you kept as a paperweight. For you it's precious, but they're played their role of faithful friends. You feel in the object they are conscious and you are conscious, and there's a relationship of friendship. What do you do then? So Mother says, I thank them gratefully for all the charm they were able to give to the outer side of our life. I wish that if they are destined to pass into other hands than ours for any length of time, these hands may be gentle to them and know all the respect that is due to what thy divine love, O Lord, has brought out from the dark inconscience of chaos. So every object of matter has been drawn out from dark inconscience of chaos to become form of substance of matter. But in this case, the Mother has related to it as that, from a spiritual perspective. in a spiritual relationship. So those objects are as if more conscious even. So one may hope that the hands be gentle to them, knowing all the respect that is due to what the divine love has built up in the evolution out of chaos. Then Mother continues, then I turn towards the future, and my gaze becomes more solemn still. What it holds in store for us I do not know nor care to know. Outer circumstances have no importance at all. My only wish is that this may be for us the beginning of a new inner period, in which, more detached from material things, we could be more conscious of thy law, and more one-pointedly consecrated to its manifestation. So it's not just the law of the divine above, it's the manifestation, the bringing down, the fixing into matter, the reshaping of life by the divine force, will, action, influence, law. So it's not the ascetic path, it's not turning away, abandoning from, detached from material things to some spirituality outside. It's the infusion and the bringing down to transform life. It is in matter, through matter, that has to now work. So, one pointedly consecrated to its manifestation, that it may be a period of greater light, greater love, of a more perfect dedication to thy cause. So we can take this prayer also in the start of a new year, but also in the hope of a new phase in human affairs with the circumstances and the possibilities that have opened up. But more importantly for all of us, let it be a new phase of our lives. So I'll reread this last line and then we will dwell on it in concentration all together, wherever we are on earth. My only wish, so I turn towards the future and my gaze becomes more solemn still. What it holds in store for us, I do not know nor care to know. Outer circumstances have no importance at all. My only wish is that this may be for us the beginning of a new inner period, in which, more detached from material things, we could be more conscious of thy law and more one-pointedly consecrated to its manifestation. One-pointedness of this purpose is extremely important to manifest the divine presence. That it may be a period of greater light, greater love, of a more perfect dedication to thy cause. In a silent adoration, I contemplate thee. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.